The sun never set on the British Empire, and for over a century the same could be said for the British pound sterling. It was the undisputed king of global finance, the currency of trade, and the bedrock of the international monetary system. But empires and their currencies are not eternal. The story of how Britain lost its reserve currency status forever is not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow, painful, and often humiliating decline, a mirror reflecting the fading light of a global superpower. It is a tale of two world wars, a political miscalculation in the desert, and the inexorable rise of a new economic titan across the Atlantic. For over a century, from the defeat of Napoleon to the outbreak of the First World War, the pound sterling was the world's anchor. This dominance was rooted in the gold standard, a system where the value of the pound was fixed to a specific amount of gold, and the Bank of England guaranteed convertibility. This simple yet powerful mechanism instilled absolute confidence. London was the undisputed financial capital, a hub where the world's trade was financed, insured, and settled. The sheer volume of British trade, the vastness of its empire, and the deep trust in its institutions made the pound the default choice for central banks and international merchants alike. Every major transaction, from the financing of railroads in Argentina to the purchase of tea in India, was settled in sterling. The rules of the game under the gold standard meant that any trade imbalance would be self-correcting. A deficit would lead to gold outflow, a contraction of the money supply, lower prices, and eventually a boost in exports. This system, policed by the Bank of England's strategic use of interest rates, created an unparalleled era of financial stability known as Pax Britannica. The pound was more than just a currency. It was a symbol of global order, a testament to British power and reliability. The confidence was so profound that even in times of minor political upheaval, the financial markets barely flinched. The pound was the definition of a hard currency, a safe haven, and the ultimate store of value, a position cemented by the City of London's sophisticated network of merchant banks, insurance houses, and the efficient market for bills of exchange, all denominated in sterling. This intricate financial ecosystem ensured that the world's capital flowed through London, reinforcing the pound's indispensable role. The first, and perhaps most fatal blow, was the First World War. The war was not just a military conflict. It was an economic catastrophe that shattered the delicate financial balance. Britain, despite its victory, emerged financially crippled. The cost of the war was astronomical, forcing the country to abandon the gold standard temporarily in 1914, and, more critically, to liquidate vast overseas assets, investments that had previously generated crucial foreign income, and incur massive debts, primarily to the United States. The financial center of gravity began its slow, inevitable shift from London to New York. The US, which had been a net debtor nation before the war, emerged as the world's largest creditor. This reversal of financial fortunes was a seismic event. The attempt to restore the pre-war financial order by returning to the gold standard in 1925, championed by then-Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill, was a disastrous misstep. The pound was pegged at its pre-war parity of $4.86, a level that was economically unsustainable, given the country's diminished industrial competitiveness, high unemployment, and the structural changes in global trade. This overvaluation made British exports prohibitively expensive and choked economic growth, leading to a prolonged period of deflation and industrial strife. The financial markets, sensing the strain, began to test the Bank of England's resolve. The pressure became unbearable during the Great Depression, and in 1931, Britain was finally forced to abandon the gold standard for good. This was a profound psychological shock, signaling to the world that the old order was truly gone. The pound was no longer backed by gold, but by the increasingly fragile promise of the British government. The formation of the sterling area, a bloc of countries, mostly former colonies, that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in London, was a desperate attempt to preserve a sphere of influence, but it masked a fundamental, irreversible decline in global standing. The Second World War completed the financial devastation. Britain fought the war almost to the point of national bankruptcy. The financial arrangements were even more punishing than the First War. The US Lend-Lease Act was a lifeline, providing essential military and economic aid. But it came with a critical condition. Britain had to further deplete its gold and dollar reserves. By 1945, Britain's debt was staggering and its economy was exhausted. The country was burdened by the sterling balances, massive debts owed to sterling area countries, accumulated during the war for supplies and services. These balances, frozen and unconvertible, hung over the pound like a financial sword of Damocles, making it impossible to maintain full convertibility. The post-war world order was formalized at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The negotiations were a contest between the old financial power, represented by John Maynard Keynes, and the new, represented by Harry Dexter White of the US Treasury. Keynes proposed the Bancor, a new international currency managed by a global central bank, designed to prevent the dominance of any single national currency. White, however, successfully pushed for a system centered on the US dollar. The final agreement established a system of fixed exchange rates, with all currencies pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. While the pound was included as one of the two key reserve currencies, the reality was that the dollar was now the dominant force. The system was essentially a dollar gold standard. The US, emerging from the war with its industrial base intact and holding 2/3 of the world's gold, was the new financial hegemon. The pound's role was relegated to that of a junior partner, its status propped up by the sterling area and strict currency controls. The post-war period was characterized by a constant, exhausting struggle to maintain the pound's value, a struggle that required repeated bailouts and austerity measures. The dream of restoring the pound to its former glory was officially over. The new reality was one of managed decline, perpetually constrained by the need to defend the sterling's fixed rate against the powerful US dollar. The year 1956 provided the most dramatic and symbolic moment of the pound's final descent: the Suez Crisis. Politically, it was a disaster for Prime Minister Anthony Eden, exposing the limits of British military and political power. Economically, it was a catastrophe for the pound. When Britain, France and Israel invaded Egypt following the nationalization of the Suez Canal by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the US government under President Eisenhower was furious and refused to support the intervention. More critically, the US Treasury and the International Monetary Fund refused to provide the necessary financial support to prop up the pound, which was immediately subjected to intense selling pressure in the foreign exchange markets. The US effectively used its financial power as a weapon. Secretary of the Treasury George Humphrey made it clear: no financial aid until Britain agreed to a complete and immediate withdrawal. Britain was forced to choose between its military adventure and the solvency of its currency. It chose solvency. The humiliation was complete. The Suez Crisis demonstrated beyond any doubt that Britain could no longer act independently on the global stage without the financial consent of the United States. The crisis triggered a massive flight from sterling, as central banks and private investors realized that the pound was no longer a reliable store of value, nor was it backed by true geopolitical power. The event shattered the remaining illusion of British financial sovereignty and accelerated the diversification of reserves away from sterling. The message was clear: the US dollar was the only currency that mattered. The political and economic consequences were profound. The crisis forced a fundamental reassessment of Britain's global role, accelerating the process of decolonization and the dismantling of the sterling area. The psychological impact on the City of London was immense. The financial world had witnessed the ultimate subordination of the pound to the dollar. The 1960s were a decade of repeated economic crises for Britain, culminating in the 1967 devaluation. Despite repeated assurances from the Labour government that the pound's value would be maintained, the persistent balance of payments deficits, fueled by a lack of industrial competitiveness and high government spending and speculative attacks, proved too much. The government had been fighting a losing battle to defend the 2-80 parity. The speculators, often referred to as the gnomes of Zurich, sensed the weakness and mounted relentless attacks. On November 18, 1967, the government was finally forced to devalue the pound by 3%, from $2.80 to $2.40. Prime Minister Harold Wilson famously and inaccurately claimed that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. The devaluation was a public admission of economic failure and a further, devastating blow to the pound's international standing. It signaled that the UK government was prioritising domestic economic management over the maintenance of the pound's international role, a necessary but final abandonment of the reserve currency mindset. The sterling area, already weakened, began to disintegrate rapidly as member countries sought to protect their own reserves by switching to the dollar. The final formal end of the sterling area came in the early 1970s as Britain prepared to join the European Economic Community. The 1970s brought further turmoil, including the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, which led to floating exchange rates, and the oil crises, which exacerbated inflation and economic stagnation in the UK. The pound was no longer fighting to maintain a fixed parity. It was now subject to the volatile forces of the free market, a market that overwhelmingly favoured the dollar. By the end of the decade, the pound's status as a major reserve currency was a historical footnote. It had been replaced entirely by the US dollar, and to a lesser extent, the German mark and the Japanese yen. The long, slow decline was complete. The pound sterling had gone from being the world's financial lingua franca to just another major currency, a powerful symbol of a bygone era. The loss of reserve currency status was not just an economic event, it was the final, definitive chapter in the story of the British Empire's decline. The economic power had shifted, and the currency followed, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new dollar-dominated world. The legacy of this loss continues to shape British economic policy, emphasizing the need for fiscal prudence and the constant battle to maintain international competitiveness in a world where the financial rules are no longer set in London. The story serves as a powerful lesson. A reserve currency is not merely a financial instrument, but a reflection of a nation's total economic, political, and military power. And when that power wanes, the currency inevitably follows. The sterling's fall was the price of 2 world wars and the cost of clinging to an imperial past in a post-imperial world.